Welcome back into another edition of Prime Sports World, and a happy hump day from everybody here at Prime Sports World. And thankfully, it is finally 24 degrees here in Fort Wayne. It's a damn heat wave. My name is David Huppin. Right there is my co-host and good friend, Mr. Israel Rivera. Welcome into the show. And on today's show, fantasy football is in the books for 2023-2024. We're about to give our fantasy football awards for some of the players that performed well and some of the players that maybe didn't perform so well as we get through this season. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back here tomorrow breaking down the divisional round game, so you don't want to miss that content. Also on Saturday, we're going to break down that breaking news of Pascal Siakam on his way to the Indiana Pacers. So keep an eye out for that content. David Huppin, Israel Rivera. What's up, brother? How are you, man? How's the weather there in Chicago?
Hey, it's warming up. We're out to single digits, buddy.
Yeah, it's good stuff, man. It's good stuff. So an update since the last time we did a live show. I got trounced in the finals in my fantasy football league. Alfonso beat me by 40 points in the finals. Like he had Joe Mixon had 3 touchdowns in that game. He had Evan Ingram who had over 20 points. He had Josh Allen in that game against Miami, and I got trounced by 40 points in that game.
At least you made it. Just to put it out there, because some guys like me, this was the worst year in fantasy football that I have ever had in my entire career of playing fantasy football. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm sharing our podcast, so I'm doing 2 things at once. But
you're like Travis Kelce in those commercials.
Yeah. So, dude, it was the worst in my fantasy football career. One league I was the highest scoring guy, and I was top 3 in scoring, and I was the number 1 guy that scored on. So you can only imagine some weeks were just very, very frustrating. So yes, and all my leagues are money leagues. I just find it more competitive for me to play
I
in
agree with
leagues
you.
that are for the money, and not for free. Like when leagues are free, I just kind of tend to just not care as much. So when they're for the money, I am like locked in all season, and it just
Yeah.
makes it fun. It just makes it more fun for the week, especially the stuff
When
that
when
we
the, when
do
the,
during the week.
when those jelly beans are on the line, I mean, when those jelly beans are on the line, man, it just makes it way more worth it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
I was also in an eliminator league that I actually won this year. I don't know if you ever played in an eliminator league. It's a
no.
wild concept. So every single week, the lowest scoring team is completely eliminated from the league, and so their entire roster is dropped into free agency,
Oh,
and
you
they're
told me
fair
about
game. And so at the end, like you basically have this, like I basically there was only two teams at the end, and you basically play to see who wins free admission into next year's league, into this other big money league. And yeah, I ended up winning. My team was so stacked at the end. Like I had like Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen, and CeeDee Lamb, and Patrick Mahomes was on my bench in that league. I had
that. Right.
Tyreek Hill, I had DJ Moore, I had DeAndre Hopkins. Like it was just absurd. Like I had George Kittle, I had Evan Ingram. I think I had Travis Kelce too. Like your team is just unreal. Like,
Oh wow, that is incredible. That is
and
incredible.
I won that eliminator. So, but let's get into it. Let's talk about fantasy football. Let's talk about our awards, and let's start with the most important award. Let's talk about fantasy football MVP as we give out the biggest prize first, unlike some other leagues.
Um. Uh. Well, I think fantasy football MVP. Um. Well, I'll say this, okay, because quarterback's gonna have the most points at the end of the year. Quarterback's gonna have the most points.
Actually, in a PPR scoring, who do you think was the highest scoring player this
You're gonna
year?
make me pull it up, David. I already have it up here.
I got it up already.
Well, was it Christian McCaffrey?
It was not. Actually, CeeDee Lamb was the number one scoring
Really?
fantasy
Oh,
player this year. Well, I mean,
PPR?
also because Christian, yeah, in PPR. Well, you got to remember, Christian McCaffrey missed a game,
Oh, he did.
basically a game and a half. He didn't play the final game
He
of the
missed
season.
week 18 too.
He averaged more points than CeeDee Lamb per game with 24.5. But CeeDee Lamb actually had more fantasy points this season than Chris McCaffrey. So did Josh Allen actually too.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
But
I thought Josh Allen had a little bit more than CeeDee Lamb, like 5 or 6 more than
nope.
CeeDee Lamb. Because that's
CeeDee
what I'm
Lamb
looking at right now. I'm looking at
PPR
Josh Allen has
scoring,
410.
at least in ESPN, like the scoring leaders on ESPN.
Okay.
It says CeeDee Lamb at 403 fantasy points, Josh Allen at 392, and Chris McCaffrey at 391.
When I'm doing these awards, I'm gonna go by PPR.
I'm going with PPR too.
So CeeDee Lamb was incredible. CeeDee Lamb was.
My fantasy MVP goes to Chris McCaffrey. McCaffrey. 60% of rosters that went to the finals had Chris McCaffrey on them. The other thing about Christian McCaffrey is the point of difference when it comes to the position he plays. He was the number one scoring running back in fantasy at 24.5 points per game. Who do you think was the number two scoring running back in the league in PPR scoring?
And PPR scoring was Breece Hall.
Breece Hall, correct. He had with 17.1 points per game. So every single week in fantasy, you were getting 7 more points a week from Chris McCaffrey than the next highest guy. That difference in 7 points is by far greater than any other position in fantasy. Josh Allen, only 2 points greater than the next highest guy in Jalen Hurts. CeeDee Lamb, 0.2 higher than the next highest guy in Tyreek Hill. Chris McCaffrey is the fantasy football MVP. And I know it's boring to say that Chris McCaffrey is the fantasy football MVP, but it's true.
Well, everything that you just said was what I was going to say. 60% of leagues that drafted him that were in the fantasy football championship had him on the roster. I mean, he was by far the most important piece of your team by far. And I mean, he like David said, he was just so far and he was just so far ahead of all running backs and major skill positions in fantasy that it just wasn't even close. So he's definitely my MVP as well. I hate to just agree with you, but I mean, look, we can't hate the Funk, right? Can't make
Yeah,
stuff.
sometimes it's just a fact. Those things are
Yeah,
just
those
absolutely
are just
true.
facts. Those are just facts.
Swinging in from fantasy MVP, let's swing back into maybe not the MVP, but we talk about value. Talking about fantasy football value for where they were originally drafted. Who gave you the best fantasy football value?
Oh man, this one it's got to be Puka Nakua. I mean, I don't even think in some leagues he wasn't drafted. I know in one of my deeper leagues he was drafted by somebody. Um I think in the AJ league he was drafted like the last overall guy just because of the stuff he was doing in training camp. But it's got to be
So
Puka Nakua.
Puka Nakua was the 51st wide receiver taken in drafts, according to Fantasy Pros. He was the 131st player taken in fantasy football this season. He was was this 1, 2, 3, 4? What's his 10? He was the 10th highest scoring fantasy football player to be drafted, 131.
Hmm.
I kind of figured you were going to say him, so I'm going to go a different direction with this prediction, with this award, and I'm actually going to go Raheem Mostert. I think Raheem Mostert is one of those guys who kind of flew under the radar in drafts. Nobody really kind of took him, but at the end of the day, Raheem Mostert was. Let's see all the position ranking. I know he dropped a little bit because he missed 2 weeks in a row, but he was the fifth highest scoring fantasy running back in fantasy this season. He was taken at 104. He was running back 36. Yeah, Raheem Mostert, you got your immense return on value. If you took Raheem Mostert and you started him a majority of the season, he gave you that value at the running back position. Because I think it's harder to find running backs. Another guy, Kyron Williams, another thing, he was running back 46. He was 128th player taken overall, according to Fantasy Pros. Kyron Williams gave you, let's see here, 21.3 fantasy points per game. He did miss, I think 4 games this season. He was the 7th highest rated running back in fantasy this year.
What about a guy in Nico Collins? I don't have where he's drafted at, but I know he's top 30.
Nico Collins was the 55th wide receiver taken in this year's draft. He was the 148th player taken in fantasy.
Yeah, that's another value guy. He was top 10 wide receiver, top just on the outside looking in, top 10 wide receiver is number 12 in PPR.
12.
Yeah.
And that also factors in the fact that CJ Stroud missed 2.5 games. I mean, who knows what I think he missed some time too. He missed 1 game against Tennessee, 2 games, 1 against Cincinnati, 1 game against Tennessee, to still be the 12th highest rated wide receiver in fantasy. That's pretty damn impressive.
Pretty damn impressive. Absolutely.
From there, not everybody can be value. How about those biggest busts when it comes to fantasy football? Who do you got as your biggest bust?
Oh, man, you know what? I hate to be like this. Due to injury, David, Joe Burrow was the biggest bust this year for me. He was terrible from the start. He got hot a little bit for those couple weeks, and then he got injured, and that was all she wrote. He was picked pretty damn high in one of my leagues, and Joe Burrow ended up being the 25th best quarterback in the league in terms of fantasy value. He started off the season 3 points, he had games of 3, 9, 4, and the last game that he had when he just kind of got injured was 8, and he was coming on strong after that bye week, 27, 22, 21.9 in PPR, but he was the biggest bust in my opinion.
I think injury is, unfortunate. I actually have a guy that was healthy the entire season and was just abysmal. He was close to actually making my next list. Actually, weirdly enough, I don't have anybody to add to my S list this year.
I do,
but
I do.
I don't have anybody to add this year. I don't have anybody to add. Like last year was Russell Wilson. I don't have the same hate for Russell Wilson. I don't have the same hate for Russell Wilson I have anybody else in the league right now. But for me, it's Miles Sanders, right? Miles Sanders was drafted as the 18th highest running back in fantasy this season. He finished with the 52nd highest rated, 52nd when it comes to running backs. And the problem with Miles Sanders is you drafted him And you always kind of thought, because he's coming off a 1,300-yard campaign as a member of the Philadelphia Eagles. He goes to Carolina. You expect a team that's going to lean on the running game, right? A team that's going to give Miles Sanders the rock. Miles Sanders, you have a young quarterback there. You want to give him the football. Miles Sanders was the 52nd highest rated running back when it was all said and done. He just never had the volume, never had the touches. Terrible, really, this season. And he was drafted before. Are you ready for this? He was drafted before James Conner, James Cook, Alvin Kamara, Isaiah Pacheco, David Montgomery, Rashad White, Khalil Herbert. Let's see who else is on this list here. Raheem Mostert, Ezekiel Elliott, all of these guys, Devon Achane, all of these guys that I just mentioned had a better season than Miles Sanders, who was the 18th highest rated running back, and he was a 44 pick overall, which is like the 5th round. That's terrible return on investment and really close to making my S list as somebody I will never touch in a fantasy football league ever again.
I'm waiting for you know what? I'm going to give you the next guy on my S list. He's probably enemy number 1 on my S list. And I can probably almost, not outdo you with the Miles Sanders one, but it's very close. Man,
I own Miles Sanders in so many leagues, and like I never dropped him because I always thought there was going to be a point in which he turned it around, and he just never did.
It's not even that you couldn't drop him; it's just after a certain point, once Chuba Hubbard had taken over the reins.
I mean, even Chuba Hubbard wasn't getting good value. Like
but I'm saying once he started getting all the carries and stuff, it's like Miles Sanders was almost borderline untradeable.
He was untradeable. Yeah.
You couldn't get anything for him. I'm gonna tell you the next guy that was on my S list that I did. The next guy that's on my shit list that I ended up getting off, right? And then it leads to my next guy that is gonna be on my S list. Okay.
All
right. You ready? Oh, we're on the S list now. Dameon Pierce. Dameon Pierce. I don't know. He was the top 10 running back taken in the draft. I know that for damn sure because I took him in the first 3 or 4 rounds. He was virtually
Dameon Pierce was the 16th highest rated running back taken. He was 46 overall when it comes to value. He went as high in some drafts as 12.
This guy was the 51st worst running back.
He was worse. He was worse than Miles Sanders.
Sanders. This guy was borderline terrible. And you want to know something, David? I ended up like a few weeks before my trade deadline in one of these leagues. I had a guy I really wanted, Michael Pittman, but I ended up settling for Cortland Sutton and the next guy that's going to go on my shit list. I ended up trading Dameon Pierce. I ended up getting him off because this one guy was like, and I told him, I said, hey, man, be careful because Devin Singletary's starting to get steam. He's going to probably take, and this was like the worst possible move for this guy, but I guess he didn't care because the 2 wide receivers he did get off on me, were like, he had so many wide receivers that these 2 guys were probably his worst. So he ended up trading me Cortland Sutton and Michael freaking Thomas. And Michael Thomas goes on my shit list for sure.
You know what? Yeah, Michael Thomas is probably on my shit list too. I now that you mention it.
Yeah, well, Michael Thomas is definitely on my shit list. So I got rid of somebody that was off my shit list, and I thought I was gonna get some type of reward with Michael Thomas and all of that, and then everything just unraveled with him this season. He got into like the altercation with his neighbor, and then all of a sudden he got hurt, and then he was just done for the season. And you thought with a new quarterback, with Derek Carr, with Dennis Allen and that offense, you thought that Michael Thomas, he was finally healthy all season. He was just meh. for majority of the season. He was flat out terrible this year.
Man, I'm with you on the Michael Thomas on my shit list. I owned him in every league I play in. I own Michael Thomas. I thought this is going to be the year. He's going to be healthy. He's going to bounce back. No. I also included him in a trade instead of Scary Terry, which is, ended up working out anyways. But like, I was like, okay, fine. Give me Michael Thomas, man. Oh, man, that was, yeah.
Scary Terry's another one that goes on my shit list, too. Scary, because for what you got for Scary Terry, he just did not perform. I mean, some game I could only count on one hand how many good games he had. He would have some, like, he was mediocre as hell, and he couldn't get in the end zone this year.
I mean, I think he got outplayed by Curtis Samuel this season.
Yeah, he did. He could not get in the end zone this year. And for a guy that had Sam Howell, who threw for a bajillion yards, for some odd reason, Scary Terry just didn't get any of the, he didn't get a lot of that value back. So,
from the shit list, let's talk about best free agent pickup. Who was the best free agency pickup? Just in general.
By far, I got two of them by far. And these two guys almost saved my season in two different leagues. Number one is Devin Achane. Devin Achane is my best free agent pickup. I don't know how the hell. I ended up picking him up in two leagues. He actually did save me in one league. And that got me into the playoffs. Especially, I mean, God, Lee, it's crazy. When I picked him up, I had, he had that one crazy good game earlier this year where they put the 70 steamer up on Denver.
Yeah.
He had, and I had him on my bench, and then then I was like, oh my God. And then like he had another good game the next week. It wasn't as good. And then he ended up hurting his knee and it kind of lost some steam. But I mean, when Raheem Mostert the last couple of weeks of the season, I mean, he got me into the playoffs. I mean, the last what was it, week 17, he had a pretty good game, if I'm not mistaken. Last, end of the year, kind of on a strong note for Devin Achane. The next free agent pickup for me, I'm sorry, David, is CJ Stroud. Because CJ Stroud, somehow, some way, he was just sitting on there on the waiver wire list in AJ's league. And then he really almost saved my season in that league. Picking up CJ Stroud made my league more, made it very competitive. I had to work the waiver wire, if you don't know, because I didn't draft in that league. My whole team was auto drafted, which I was pissed about. And I had Daniel Jones sitting there. Oh shit, he should have won on shit list too. I had Daniel Jones.
Dan Jones should go on the shit list.
Yeah, Daniel Jones was sitting there as my starting quarterback, and I ended up picking up CJ Stroud, and it kind of worked out for me.
Yeah, I'll just real quick. So personally, Juwan Johnson was another guy, a tight end for the New Orleans Saints. In the playoff weeks was really strong down the stretch. 11 points, 14, 23, and 7 in playoff rounds. That's good value for a guy you just pick up and start. But I think we're talking about free agency. Like, we're going to talk about those two Ram guys. I mean, Puka Nacua and Kyron Williams, two guys that probably went undrafted in most drafts. In one league, I was able to pick up Kyron Williams and flip him for TJ Hawkinson, which is a trade that I still feel really good about, even with the success of Kyron Williams down the stretch of that season. And then Puka Nacua, who I made a terrible decision in AJ's league to trade him basically straight up for Evan Ingram. Even though I needed a tight end in that league, Puka Nacua would have been a better option than Evan Ingram at the tight end position. I could have just streamlined the tight end and just dealt with it that way. But those two guys in most fantasy football leagues weren't drafted. You had probably picked them up in free agency. Those are guys that basically carried a lot of fantasy teams. I think we look at the numbers. Kyron Williams on 40% of teams that went to the fantasy football championships. His average draft position was undrafted. Puka Nacua, 36% of teams that went to the finals also had Puka Nacua on them. He also went undrafted. And then Sam Laporta, another guy too. His average draft position, 165.5. 38% of teams that went to the finals had Sam Laporta on their roster.
Yeah, Sam Laporta was a godsend. I mean, nobody thought he was going to have that season that he had in Detroit.
Rasheed Rice, another guy who went undrafted, on 29% of rosters that went to the finals.
I'll say this for sure. We'll say this: those two guys won't be going undrafted next year. They'll probably be the highest, one of the highest in the position rank.
Definitely not. Swinging into, let's just break down the position. So, talking about quarterback position. So, the best quarterback this year in fantasy football was Josh Allen. What are your thoughts on Josh Allen being the best quarterback in fantasy this year?
I mean, he did it all. I mean, what did he have? 41 total touchdowns. He did it all with his. He did it again. Running the football, passing the football. I think I'm right with that, right? 40. Is it 41?
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
40.
So 40 math here. 44 total touchdowns for Josh Allen. 4,300 yards passing, 29 touchdowns, 500 yards rushing, and 15 rushing touchdowns. Good for 23.1 fantasy points, 2.1 higher than the next closest guy. Josh Allen, does everything. He gives you the crazy. Yeah, Jalen Hurts was number 2. He's really on the strength of his rushing totals. 600 yards rushing and 15 rushing touchdowns for him. But Josh Allen gives you the gaudy passing numbers, and he also gives you the rushing totals. I mean, we saw it in that playoff game. Josh Allen can beat you with his legs.
I mean, I think honestly from the get go, Josh Allen was just far ahead of it, even ahead of Jalen Hurts, because it was like every week it was like Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, almost every week. So yeah, I mean, he's not going to win the MVP, but he's going to he's probably the best quarterback in fantasy. Lamar Jackson, I mean, he's going to win the MVP, but it's just, just the element of having Lamar Jackson opened it up for everybody else. We should have best pickup probably could have been Gus Edwards too, because he had 10 plus rushing touchdowns as well, and that was off of Lamar Jackson. But Josh Allen definitely hands down was the best quarterback. Fantasy, the stats don't lie.
Gus Edwards was average, so he was the 151st average player taken. He was running back 52. I do not know if I'm going to be able to find him on this list. So he's not in the top. What is this? I don't know what this number is, but
you get my point. Is like Lamar Jackson just kind of opened it up for he probably could be up there, with numbers, but he doesn't have to do as much because he has a much more talented team around him.
Yeah. But I think the top rounding out the top 5 when we talk about the quarterback position: Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Dak Prescott, Lamar Jackson, and Jordan Love actually rounded out the top 5. That's the core.
That's his last. That's because of the last 9 games that he had.
Yeah, it was really strong. 32 total touchdowns through the air. I think he was second in total into passing touchdowns. So Jordan Love had a fantastic season this year. Swinging into running back, the number 1 running back was obviously, as I mentioned, fantasy MVP Christian McCaffrey. 1,400 yards rushing, 500 yards receiving. He also had 21 total touchdowns, 7 fantasy points higher than the next closest guy, which is Breece Hall. Also 100 points more, scored 100 more points than the next closest guy.
Yeah, that's Breece money, Breece lightning, Breece money, Breece lightning. Yeah.
If you had to try to predict who the top 5 guys are, who could you do it?
For what?
Running back.
For this year?
For
next
points
year.
No. So this year, who are the top 5 scoring running backs in fantasy this year?
If I wasn't looking at my fantasy rankings right now, I'm sorry. I go. Obviously Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall. It's not Saquon Barkley. It's Travis Etienne is one of them.
Travis Etienne is 3.
Oh man, killing me here. I want to say it's not Jahmyr Gibbs. Jahmyr Gibbs is top 10.
Jahmyr Gibbs is like 8 or 9.
Yeah.
So the top 5: Raheem Mostert is 5. Rashad White is 4.
Rashad White. Okay. You did mention
Travis Etienne at 3. Breece Hall is 2, and Chris McCaffrey at 1. And then outside, go round out the top 10 real quick. Joe Mixon at 6, Kyron Williams at 7, Derrick Henry at 8, Bijan Robinson at 9, and Jahmyr Gibbs at 10.
Man, Bijan Robinson had a great start to the year, and then he, had like splashes here and there. If he was just extra consistent, he probably would be in that top 5. In my opinion,
a lot of his fantasy value was carried by his receptions. So he was He was the seventh. He had the seventh most receptions in terms of running backs this season, because he only rushed for 974 yards this year, and only had 4 touchdowns. So in PPR scoring, his value was maintained by the fact that he caught 58 balls this year, and I would expect him to just continue that kind of production.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, moving
Uh,
forward.
Yeah. To the wide receiver position, CeeDee Lamb, number one scorer in fantasy, but him and Tyreek Hill neck and neck, as Tyreek Hill did miss a few games here and there down the stretch of the season.
I'm a little bit.
20.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, I'm going to say this. Tyreek Hill missed a couple games, and then also he, they got up on high on a couple teams where he got taken out in the whole fourth quarter, pretty much, or half the fourth quarter. And then there were some games where he got injured in them where he couldn't finish the game or he just was ineffective.
Yeah, so like that Tennessee game where he got banged up originally, he only had 4 catches for 61 yards and no touchdowns. And then he did not play in that game against the Jets the week after.
When he was healthy, he was the best wide receiver in fantasy, hands down. Like when Tyreek Hill was hitting on all cylinders, he was by far the best wide receiver in football.
I mean, listen to this 4-game stretch. All right, let's just go his beginning of the season, right before his bye. 44 points, 15, 30, 10, 32, 28, 25, 25, 12.
That's insane. And then after the bye week, go after the bye week.
30, 25, 32, 10. He missed that game against the Jets. 18, 13, 21.
That's insane. It's insane.
Yeah, I mean, if he doesn't get banged up, he's for sure the number one wide receiver in fantasy. He probably breaks the 2,000-yard plateau. He probably breaks that Calvin Johnson record. He probably wins MVP if he doesn't get injured and misses some time there. Rounding out the top 5 when it comes to wide receivers, Amon-Ra St. Brown at number 3, Puka Nacua at 4, and A.J. Brown at 5. Who do you think is 6 if you don't have it in front of you?
I'll just go ahead and guess because I did have it in front of me, but number 6, Mike Evans.
Mike Evans is 7. DJ Moore is actually number 6.
Moore.
16.9 fantasy points for him. But I think it talks about where there's like a tier here, right? So like there are clearly like 2 main guys in fantasy when it comes to the wide receiver position. You got CeeDee Lamb and Tyreek Hill. They both average over 23 fantasy points per game. The next closest guy is Amon-Ra St. Brown, who at 20 points per fantasy game in fantasy. And then the next tier is probably like those next guys, Puka Nacua and down, because they average 17 fantasy points per game. So, like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Tyreek Hill, and CeeDee Lamb feel like they're in a tier by themselves. Like they're the most.
Let me tell you something, David. I think in the top 10 though, the most impressive is Devontae Adams though, because he literally had a banged up Jimmy Garoppolo who was wildly inconsistent, and then he had Aiden O'Connell who was a rookie from Purdue, I don't even know. Did Aiden O'Connell even get drafted? I don't know. I don't think so. And so Devontae Adams, for him being a top 10 wide receiver this season.
Well, I mean, a lot of that has to do with his target share. I mean, he had second most targets out of any wide receiver in the NFL.
I mean, that is just impressive. That is just impressive to have those, not very consistent.
I don't necessarily disagree with you.
Amari Cooper too. Amari Cooper too, right? I mean, where was Amari Cooper at? He was top 20 wide receiver.
Yeah,
he had 4 different starting quarterbacks.
He was exactly 20 actually. So
yeah.
Moving on from there, we got the tight end, number 1 fantasy tight end, Sam Laporta. Rookie Sam Laporta, number 1 scorer in fantasy at 14.1 points per game. He was, pretty close. All the top 4 guys in terms of numbers were all fairly similar. 14.6 points for TJ Hawkinson, 14.6 points for Travis Kelce, 13.5 points for Evan Ingram, and 14.1 points for Sam Laporta. George Kittle at 5 rounds out that top 5 at 12.7 points.
Yeah, you got 3 Iowa tight ends. Something about those Iowa tight ends, man, that just do well in the league. I thought David Njoku, he was very close to being a top 5 tight end. What a hell of a
Yeah,
bounce back season for him.
six. He was six, 12.6 fantasy points per game, so 1.1 less than George Kittle. He was only 2 points total less than George Kittle on the entire season, and he was 20 points higher than wide receiver 7, who was Trey McBride. Shockingly, actually.
Yeah, no, Trey McBride. I mean, once Kyler Murray came back, Trey McBride had a hell of a second half of the season.
Yeah. And then to the final two positions, we'll talk about defenses. Number one defense in terms of fantasy football scoring was the Dallas Cowboys and the Baltimore Ravens. Actually, weirdly enough, those two teams actually tied when it comes to fantasy points this year, 172 apiece, averaging 10.1 points per game as the Ravens and Cowboys leader of the pack when it comes to fantasy football and defensive points.
Oh, man. You know what? If you had the rate, well, I guess week 1 and week 4 don't really count. I mean, because the Dallas Cowboys had two highest outputs in fantasy. You know, with what was it, 37 in week 1 and 27 points in week 4. What? And then what was it? Thanksgiving they had what? I think Thanksgiving they had 21 points. Was that week 11? Something like that.
They only had 14 points on Thanksgiving against
14?
the Washington Commanders. They had 23 points the week before that against the Carolina Panthers.
Oh my God. They were just, and Deron Bland with the, every time he got a 6, he was a big part of the Dallas Cowboys having a top defense with all those pick sixes he had. But I think when you look at it, the Baltimore Ravens as a whole were probably better than the Dallas Cowboys because consistently week in, week out, they gave you 10 plus points.
Yeah, there are 0 negative point games on this when it comes to the Baltimore Ravens. They gave you consistent points. The Dallas Cowboys had 3 games where they gave you negative points, 4 games where they gave you negative points or 0. That credential does not exist on the Baltimore Ravens line. They gave you consistent positive fantasy points every single week. The Ravens is the defense I would have liked to have had for the entire season. Rounding out the top 5 is Cleveland Browns, Jets, and Bills. 9.8, 9.4, 9.3, respectively. And there's a considerable dip between the Bills and the next closest team, which is shockingly the Kansas City Chiefs at 8.2 fantasy points per game.
Man, the Cleveland Browns, man, their defense was elite. We talked about it all year. I mean, they were another team that you hardly saw those goose eggs, or you hardly saw a negative on the record. I think they had one, which was in week 13. But other than that, you rarely saw a goose egg on their. You didn't even see. They had those goose eggs on their scoreboard, and they were just a consistent. Juggernaut of a defense, for everything that happened to them offensively. You would have thought that the offense would, kind of leave that defense on the field, but that defense really, catapulted a lot of those wins.
I mean, you can make that same argument for the Jets defense too. I mean, the Jets, they were on the football field a lot because Aaron Rodgers got injured 4 plays in, and you basically had to rely on this defense. And the Jets are another team. I mean, you talk about 1 negative point game when it comes to the defensive side of the football. That's consistency when it comes to the fantasy football and it comes to the defensive side.
The Jets were sick. If the Jets were sick, I mean, you talk about the Jets, if they had a quarterback in Aaron Rodgers, I mean, who knows if their defense probably would have been the number 1 defense if they would have had some type of rest, on the season. So.
And then to the final position, let's talk about fantasy football. Let's talk about the kickers. I don't know if you looked up this already, but do you know who the number 1 kicker in fantasy was?
I already looked it up, brother. It's Brandon Aubrey.
Brandon Aubrey was the number 1 kicker in fantasy, 25 points higher than the next closest guy, which is, of course, Justin Tucker. But 10.6 fantasy points from Brandon Aubrey. I do not believe he did miss 2 field goals there down the stretch in the final game of the year. But he was just consistent as it gets, giving you weekly fantasy production, including 23 fantasy points against the Philadelphia Eagles, an absurd stat line from Brandon Aubrey.
Your boy Cairo Santos from Chicago's on there too. He's the top 3 kicker.
Yeah, number 4.
Yeah.
Two guys tied at 9.1 fantasy. Like, that's crazy to me that like we have three guys that all have the same amount of fantasy points at the kicking position. But then Brandon Aubrey, but yeah, Harrison Bucker of top 5, Cairo Santos, Jake Elliott, Justin Tucker, and then Brandon Aubrey really burst onto the season. Talk about another guy. Probably a lot of fantasy players didn't draft because they never heard of him. Probably a guy they picked up as a streaming option and just kind of stuck with him all season. Another guy who probably paid dividends for fantasy football players this season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, Brandon Aubrey was, he was lights out for Dallas, man. He was lights out for Dallas this year. But think about it, three guys that was kickers for 3 guys in the top 5. I think it's Matt Gay, Cairo Santos, and let me look it up again, and Jason Myers. All 3 of those guys on non-playoff teams, and they were top 5 kickers.
I mean, you look at the top 10. I mean, the New Orleans Saints didn't make the playoffs. They have a kicker in the top 10. Cameron Dickers in the top 10. Mm-hmm. Colts, yeah, like 7. Hold on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 of the top 5 kickers played on teams that did not make the playoffs.
Yeah.
So pretty interesting. But yeah, that's been our Fantasy Football Awards show. Thank you very much for checking us out here at Prime Sports World. We will do a season like a way too early fantasy football rankings at some point in a month or so. But right now we're going to focus on the fantasy football playoffs, and we're going to transition a little bit into basketball season as there is just tons of stuff going on in the NBA. But thank you very much for checking us out. Please like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. I'm David Huppin. Right there is the CEO of Israel Rivera. And Izzy, what do we do here at the Prime, my friend?
Here we go. We bring that heat, baby.
We'll be back here tomorrow breaking down the divisional round as the Packers try to continue. I'll see you tomorrow, man.